I walked into my 70th birthday, thinking it would be a celebration, but the moment I stepped through those doors, I felt it. The distance, the whispers, the eyes that didn't quite meet mine. The smiles were polite, but cold, like they'd already decided what part one was meant to play in the evening. Every toast, every laugh, every carefully chosen word chipped away at something deep inside me, until the truth I'd been avoiding for years stood right in front of me. By the time the candles burned low, I was done pretending. One decision, made in that very room, would leave them stunned, the guests silent, and the weight of the past replaced by something they would not soon forget. Stay with me until the end, like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you think I did and where you're watching from. I heard the words before I felt the warmth of the ballroom lights. They cut through the soft jazz and clink of glassware like a cold draft sneaking under a door in winter. I paused with one hand still on the brass handle, the other smoothing the front of my navy blazer as if neat fabric could stitch together a heart that had just been pricked. My name is Harold Whitman, 70 years old today, tall, a little too lean these days, hair the color of fresh snow and hands that still remember the weight of drafting pencils and the bite of balsa wood. I spent 4 decades as an architect carving skylines, rescuing stubborn brick facades, and arguing with gravity until it gave me a pass. Yet in this room, at my own celebration, I felt smaller than a footnote. I stepped fully inside and let the door shut behind me. A rented hall, but tastefully done. White linens, floating candles in crystal bowls, a pair of gilded mirrors, and a long table that groaned under platters of rosemary chicken, honey carrots, and soft rolls glossed with butter. The flowers, cream roses, eucalyptus, and pale blue thistle, were arranged as if someone wanted the place to appear gentle. It almost worked. Michael was in a slate suit he hadn't paid for. He prefers a credit limit to a budget, and Laura wore a shimmering dress that demanded attention she hadn't earned. They were already surrounded by friends who laughed too loudly and relatives who should have known better. I moved toward them, forcing a smile that felt like a polite bruise. "Dad," Michael said, glancing past me as if I were a column interrupting his sightline. "You made it. It is his birthday," one cousin muttered, then reddened and looked away. Laura kissed the air near my cheek, as if contact might be contagious. "You look fine," she said, the pause doing the insults heavy lifting. I cleared my throat. "Thank you for organizing this." Michael lifted his glass. "Well, it's what families do, right?" He managed to make the word family sound like an invoice. I could have replied with 100 memories. Saturday mornings building a treehouse he used twice. The 5th grade solar system diorama Laura left in the rain that I rescued with hairdryers and patience. The 2 of them sleeping on my chest when thunderstorms terrified them. Instead, I nodded and stepped away, letting them return to their hushed arithmetic about bedrooms and rent and who deserved the sunlit office. I drifted along the perimeter of the room. Some guests greeted me kindly, old colleagues with recall in their eyes. A neighbor who still missed Margaret, a retired city planner who asked how my knees were holding up. My knees were fine. It was the invisible joints, the ones that hinge a father to his children, that felt inflamed. Across the hall, Laura gestured broadly, framing my home with her hands as if she were pitching a show. "The kitchen's dated," she said, "but we'll knock down the wall and go open concept. Better for entertaining." Entertaining what? Her vanity? Her certainty that life will always arrange its furniture for her convenience? Michael nodded, already assigning square footage. "We can Airbnb the guest room," he said. "Offset the mortgage. The old place can finally make us some money." I walked to the refreshments table and poured water, my fingers steady because pride, unlike age, can be commanded. I remembered Margaret's last birthday in that house. The lemon cake I baked from scratch, the lopsided frosting she swore was charming, the kids grinning with sugar-dusted lips and sticky hands. It was easier to hold grief than disgust. Grief doesn't smirk. A waiter offered me champagne. I declined. I needed clarity more than sparkle. Michael clinked his glass with a fork. Conversation thinned. "A toast to Dad," he announced, wearing the smile of a man auditioning for likability. 70 years young. May the next chapter be restful. Restful. A word that sounds like kindness until you hear the shovel in it. Polite laughter. Laura slid in close to him, shoulder to shoulder, a tableau of entitlement. "And may the family home be used wisely," she added, "for those who will actually, use it." Someone tittered. Someone else coughed. The pianist missed a note. I felt the old instinct to rescue a room, to apologize for tension I hadn't caused, to make everything smooth so everyone could swallow. But this time I let the silence stand on its own 2 feet and breathe. If they wanted to test the acoustics of humiliation, I could be their sound engineer. "Thank you," I said evenly when the laughter died. "I appreciate your foresight." Michael blinked, maybe hearing the hinge in my tone. Laura lifted her chin, daring me to object to the rewrite of my life they were composing in real time. "Dad, don't be sensitive," she said. "We're just being practical. Memories are sweet, but taxes aren't nostalgic." "We could take the load off," Michael added. "It's a big house. A lot to manage. You should focus on enjoying yourself." Enjoying myself. The last time someone tried to sell me that line, it came stapled to a timeshare. I studied their faces, features I recognized from baby photos lining my study at home. Michael had my brows, the assertive angle that once framed youthful determination. Laura had Margaret's mouth, though hers found fewer reasons to smile sincerely. I thought of the years they lived under my roof. Shoes kicked under the bench by the mudroom, backpacks slumping by the stairs, the smell of tomato soup and grilled cheese on snow days, whispered jokes during power outages, birthday candles that never seemed to run out. Where had that family gone? When exactly had we traded a home for a scoreboard? A second cousin ambled up, oblivious. "Harold, rumor is you might finally part with that place," he said, half teasing, half hungry. "Sell high, right?" "Rumors are efficient," I replied. "They save people the trouble of asking." He flushed and retreated. I almost felt sorry. Almost. "Dad," Laura tried again. "We're thinking of having the lawyer swing by later, just to look over some options." "Simple stuff." "Simple," Michael echoed. "A power of attorney, nothing dramatic." I looked from one to the other and saw not merely greed, but something more dangerous, the arrogance of inevitability. They had already moved in mentally, already painted over my history with their palette of convenience, already deleted my name from the deed in their hearts. A clock near the bandstand ticked on, unworried. Time does not take sides. It simply keeps excellent records. I slipped my hand into the inside pocket of my blazer and felt the crisp edges of an envelope I had tucked there that morning. The paper was reassuring, a quiet anchor in a noisy sea. The smirk on his face was one I had seen 100 times before, half concern, half condescension. Laura, dressed in a shimmering gold dress that caught the chandelier light, chimed in, "Oh, come on, Michael. Dad knows that place is too much for him now. It's practically falling apart. We could help him get a nice condo downtown. Easier for everyone." The way she said, we sent a chill down my spine. We didn't mean family. It meant them making decisions about my life without me. I cleared my throat, trying to reframe their words as well-meaning concern, but before I could respond, Laura waved her hand dismissively as if to say my input was unnecessary. "Anyway," she continued to a nearby couple, "it's just not practical for someone his age to live in a place like that. We've already started talking to a realtor friend." My fingers curled around my wine glass. They weren't even disguising it anymore. Not even the courtesy of speaking behind closed doors. It was a public announcement of my supposed incompetence. The couple they were speaking to nodded along politely, though their eyes flicked toward me with that mix of pity and awkwardness people were when they witness a family's dirty laundry aired in public. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of my home, I said, forcing my voice to stay even. But Michael just chuckled, that deep, patronizing sound. Dad, we're just thinking ahead. It's called being practical. The word practical hit me like a shove in the chest. Practical to them meant stripping me of the place where I'd lived half my life, when my late wife's rose garden still bloomed every spring. Practical meant erasing pieces of me for their convenience. I looked around the table, hoping to find an ally, but the others were too busy with their meals or pretending not to hear. It was a strange sort of loneliness to be surrounded by your own family and feel utterly outnumbered. Just as I was swallowing the bitterness, Michael leaned forward with a sly grin. You know, Dad, selling now would be smart before the market dips again. You could give us our shares while you're still around to see us enjoy them. His words drew a few startled laughs from the guests nearby, as if it were all a big joke. But it wasn't a joke to me. It was a message wrapped in humor, but with the sharp edges fully intact. I could almost hear the unspoken, "You're old. You're fading. It's time to hand over what's ours." I felt my jaw tighten. I remembered my father, a man who had worked his whole life for the modest home he left me. He would have been appalled to see his grandchildren treating their father like some fragile obstacle standing in the way of inheritance. Laura's voice cut through my thoughts. Michael, don't be greedy. We'll split fairly. But I do want first pick of the antique pieces. That armoire in the upstairs hall, it would look perfect in my guest room. I turned to her sharply. That was your mother's, I said, my voice low but firm. She loved that piece. Laura just smiled sweetly, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Exactly. I'd be keeping it in the family. The gall of it all made my chest ache. Not from the weight of years, but from the betrayal sitting right in front of me, dressed in gold and grinning as though my feelings were an afterthought. The guests kept eating, the clinking of cutlery filling the space where my words should have been. I took a sip of wine, letting the bitterness coat my mouth, wishing I could wash down the anger with it. I thought about speaking out, telling them in no uncertain terms that my home was not theirs to divvy up like scavengers at a feast, but something in me held back. Maybe it was the years of trying to keep the peace. Maybe it was knowing that the battle I needed to fight tonight wasn't with words, but with patience. Let them think I was quiet because I was tired. Let them believe they'd won the first round. They had no idea the game I was about to play. I forced a smile, nodding as if I were conceding. You two always did like to plan ahead, I said lightly. Michael leaned toward Laura, his elbow resting casually on the tablecloth, and said, Once we have the place, I'll take the master bedroom. It's got the best light in the mornings, perfect for my workouts. The office can be converted into a media room. Laura didn't hesitate. Fine, as long as I get the upstairs suite with the balcony. I've always loved the view from there. Oh, and the guest bedroom can be turned into my walk-in closet. I've been dying for the space. Their voices carried easily, and I could see a few guests glance at me with discomfort, as though wondering if I had any say in the property they were dividing like spoils of war. My fork hovered above the cheesecake on my plate, but I had no appetite. Instead, I studied them both, their faces animated with excitement, oblivious to the insult their words carried. They were no longer talking about my home as a living, breathing place filled with history. To them, it was simply an asset to be stripped and remodeled to fit their desires. We'll have to do something about those old wooden chairs in the living room, Laura continued, a wrinkle forming between her brows. They're so outdated. I know a place that sells imported Italian sofas, all clean lines and neutral tones. We could have the whole space looking modern within a month. Michael grinned. We'll sell the chairs for whatever we can get. Maybe a few $100s. Every bit counts. My grip on the fork tightened until my knuckles whitened. Those chairs weren't just furniture. I had carved them myself in my workshop, sanding and shaping each piece over weeks, pouring the same patience into them that I had once poured into my children. I remembered Margaret sitting in one, her knitting in her lap, sunlight pouring through the window beside her. To hear them dismissed as junk was almost more than I could take. I set the fork down slowly, forcing myself to take a sip of water before I spoke. Those chairs have been in our family for decades, I said, my voice steady, but carrying an edge that made Laura glance at me briefly before waving a hand. Exactly. They're old, Dad. It's time for something new. Michael chuckled. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills, you know. It was a familiar refrain tonight. This idea that practicality and money outweighed every memory, every story attached to the home I had built and maintained. They saw me not as a person with a lifetime of experiences, but as a caretaker holding on to something they believed was already theirs. Dessert was served, and the chatter of the room rose again, but their conversation stayed fixed on the house. They moved from furniture to the garden, discussing which trees should be cut down to open up the space, and whether the rose bushes could be removed to make room for a deck. We could host big parties there, Laura said dreamily. Imagine summer nights with friends, music playing, everyone enjoying the space without all those overgrown plants. Overgrown plants. The same garden Margaret had tended lovingly for years, the one I had kept alive every season since she passed. I didn't speak this time. I simply listened, letting their words etch themselves into my mind. Every detail of their plans, every dismissive remark, every instance where they placed their own convenience over the value of what already existed, it was all fuel for the decision I was quietly making. At one point, Michael pulled out his phone and began showing Laura photos of renovation ideas. Look at this kitchen, he said, tapping the screen. We could tear out that old island and replace it with something like this. Quartz countertops, built-in wine fridge, maybe even smart appliances. Laura leaned in, eyes bright. Yes, and we could knock down the wall between the kitchen and dining room. Open concept living. So much better for entertaining. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that they didn't see me as part of the house's future. I was simply the obstacle to be managed until they could begin their grand redesign. They weren't envisioning a home. They were envisioning a prize, one they believed they had already won. I looked around the table, noting how other guests were avoiding eye contact with me. Some shifted in their seats. Others busied themselves with their desserts, clearly uncomfortable with the way my children were speaking. But no one intervened. Why would they? It wasn't their house, their history, their family unraveling in public view. By the time coffee was served, Michael and Laura had moved on to discussing finances. We'll have to budget for the renovations, Michael said thoughtfully. We can sell off some of the antiques, maybe put the rest in storage until we decide what to keep. Laura nodded. I know a dealer who'd take a lot of it off our hands. The armoire, the dining set, even the china. Honestly, we could start fresh. I felt something inside me harden. Not break, not crack, but solidify into a resolve I hadn't felt in years. They thought they were being clever, laying out their plans in front of me as if daring me to object. They mistook my silence for defeat, but all they were doing was giving me every reason I needed to act. I leaned back in my chair, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of my mouth. Let them keep talking. Here's hoping he leaves it to someone who knows how to manage property wisely, instead of wasting it on people who wouldn't appreciate it. His smirk was aimed directly at me, and the sting of his words was amplified by the chuckles that rippled through the crowd. Some laughed awkwardly, unsure whether it was truly a joke, while others seemed to relish the jab. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of their eyes on me. My instinct was to respond, to remind everyone of what that house meant, but I could already see Laura shifting in her chair, preparing to add her own insult. And she didn't disappoint. "Yes, and let's hope Dad uses good judgment when the time comes," she said, her voice bright and laced with mockery. "If he ever decided to leave it to someone outside the family, well, I'd have to assume he'd lost his mind." Laughter again, louder this time, as if she had delivered a punchline everyone had been waiting for. I noticed a few guests exchange uneasy glances, but none of them spoke up. It was easier to join in or stay silent than to challenge the favored children of the night. My chest tightened, not with age, but with the quiet fury of a man being stripped of dignity in front of the very people who were supposed to honor him. Laura leaned back, her expression one of smug satisfaction, while Michael took another sip of wine, clearly pleased with himself. I let my gaze drift across the table, catching sight of an old friend, Richard, who gave me the smallest shake of his head. It was a gesture that said he understood, but also one that confirmed he wouldn't interfere. This was my battle, and it was being fought on a stage where my children controlled the script. The conversation shifted, but the damage was done. Michael and Laura had planted their narrative in the minds of everyone present, that they were the rightful heirs, the only ones capable of preserving the house, and that any other choice would be madness. They had turned my birthday into a referendum on my competence, and they were winning the vote. I forced myself to pick up my water glass and take a slow sip, using the moment to steady my breathing. My silence, I decided, would not be a surrender, it would be a weapon. They were too arrogant to see it, but every word they spoke tonight was another thread in the rope they were weaving around themselves. As the dinner resumed, Laura began recounting stories from her childhood, each one carefully crafted to paint her as the dutiful daughter who had always looked after her father. "Remember when I stayed with you for a whole week after Mom passed?" she said, her tone dripping with nostalgia. "I cooked dinner for you every night." What she didn't mention was that she had brought her boyfriend with her, and most of those dinners had been takeout she put on my credit card. Michael laughed and jumped in with his own selective memory. "And remember when I fixed that leaky faucet in the kitchen? Saved you a bunch of money on a plumber." He neglected to add that he had made the leak worse, and I had ended up calling a plumber anyway. Their revisionist history played well to the audience, though. People nodded along, smiling at the heartwarming image of my caring children. I felt my jaw tighten again, but I kept my voice calm when I finally spoke. "I do remember those times," I said, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "I remember them very clearly." My tone must have carried something they didn't expect, because Laura's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. Michael simply smirked, convinced I was acknowledging their generosity. The rest of the evening unfolded like a well-rehearsed play. Michael and Laura took turns making subtle digs at my ability to manage my affairs, each comment met with polite laughter or sympathetic nods. At one point, Laura even gestured toward me as she told a story about how Dad once misplaced the property tax bill and almost missed the payment. The pianist's soft melody filled the spaces between conversations, but nothing could drown out the words that came next. I had been quiet for too long, so I decided to interject, not to confront them outright, but to remind them, and perhaps the guests, that the house they were dissecting was more than brick and wood. "Do you remember?" I began, my voice carrying just enough to reach those nearby. "When your mother planted the first rose bush in the garden? It was spring, and she said the blooms would outlast us all. Every year since, I've kept that garden alive for her. I allowed the memory to hang there, a small offering of sentiment in a room that seemed allergic to it." But before I could continue, Michael cut in with a dismissive chuckle. "Memories are nice, Dad, but they can't pay the property tax." His tone was so casual it might have been mistaken for practicality if not for the smirk that followed. I felt the weight of his words settle over me, not because of the truth in them. Taxes were hardly an issue for me, but because of the complete disregard for what I had just shared. Laura, checking her watch as if I were wasting her time, added, "Let's skip the old stories. What matters now is whose name will be on the deed soon. That's the conversation we should be having." She said it with the efficiency of someone closing a deal, not speaking to the father who had raised her. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking between us, perhaps wondering if they should step in or pretend they hadn't heard. Most chose the latter. I took a slow sip of water, forcing myself to swallow both the drink and the growing urge to tell them exactly what I thought. Instead, I set the glass down gently and studied them the way an architect studies a flawed blueprint, noting every weak point, every structural failure. Michael's arrogance was in his posture, sprawled in his chair, chin tilted up, the confidence of a man convinced the future was already his. Laura's was in her impatience, her constant glances at her phone, her need to control the tempo of the conversation so it never lingered too long on anything that might expose her lack of true care. "You both seem very certain about the future," I said evenly. "Perhaps too certain." Michael shrugged. "It's just logical, Dad. The house is a big responsibility, and you're not getting any younger. We can take that off your plate." Laura nodded, her tone brisk. "Exactly. Think of it as us doing you a favor. A favor." That word almost made me laugh out loud, but I held it in. If this was their idea of doing me a favor, it was the kind that came with strings thick enough to strangle a man. I leaned back in my chair, letting the room's warm light wash over me, masking the cold calculation going on in my mind. Every time they dismissed me, every time they turned my memories into inconveniences, they handed me another brick for the wall I was building between us. This wasn't about the property anymore. It was about respect, about the way they saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle. I let a few moments of silence pass before I spoke again, my tone lighter, almost conversational. "And what happens if I decide the house stays exactly where it is, under the same ownership it's had for decades?" Michael smiled as though humoring a child. "We both know that's not realistic, Dad." Laura added quickly, "We'd have to step in eventually. Might as well make it official sooner rather than later." Her certainty was almost admirable in its brazenness. They had no idea that with each confident declaration, they were pushing themselves further from the very thing they wanted. The rest of the table had fallen into a polite quiet, the kind that says everyone is listening even if they're pretending not to. I could feel the attention on us, but I didn't mind. This was the theater they had chosen, and I was content to let them believe they were the stars. "Well," I said finally, my voice steady, "I suppose we'll see how things unfold." I could see Michael exchange a quick glance with Laura, a silent conversation passing between them. They thought my calm was resignation. They thought my lack of argument meant they had convinced me. And that was fine. Let them think that. It was easier than explaining that I was simply giving them enough rope to hang their own ambitions. As the dinner service wound down, Laura leaned over to Michael, speaking in a voice that wasn't as quiet as she probably thought. "I'll get the paperwork from the lawyer this week." Michael and Laura, the way a chess player studies his opponent, tracking patterns, anticipating moves, preparing for the moment to strike. I hadn't planned for the breaking point to come so suddenly, but sometimes the last straw isn't grand or dramatic. It's simply the moment you realize you can't stomach another second of the same game. Laura was in the middle of explaining, to anyone who would listen, how Dad will feel so much better once he doesn't have to deal with that house anymore. She had a hand on the arm of one of my old colleagues, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, but still nodded politely as she painted her version of my future. We'll set him up in a nice condo near the park, she continued, her voice sugary but firm. He can have a smaller space to keep tidy, and Michael and I can take care of the big place. It's just logical. Logical. That word again. I could have sworn it had become their personal slogan for the night, as if repeating it often enough would make it true. Michael, not to be outdone, jumped in, and he won't have to worry about yard work or repairs. We'll take all that off his plate. He can just relax. Relax. The same word people use when they've already decided your role in life is over. I caught the eye of the colleague Laura had cornered, and I could see the discomfort there, the recognition that this wasn't a conversation about care or concern, but about acquisition. That's when Michael made the mistake that pushed me past the edge. You know, he said with a grin, turning to face the table as if addressing the entire room. We could even rent the place out for events. Weddings, retreats, maybe corporate gatherings. It could be a great income stream. Dad's never really maximized its potential. The implication hung in the air. I'd been wasting something valuable, holding it back from its true purpose, which in their eyes was nothing more than a cash machine. My grip on the edge of the table tightened until I could feel the tendons in my hand straining. Every muscle in my body wanted to stand up and tell them, in no uncertain terms, exactly what I thought of their plans. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, my expression calm, my voice level when I finally spoke. You two certainly seem to have my future all mapped out. Laura smiled like a cat that had cornered its prey. We're just thinking ahead, Dad. You'll thank us later. Yes, Michael added. It's all for your benefit. My benefit. The words were so hollow, I could almost hear the echo inside them. I looked at their faces, so certain, so smug, and I knew that no amount of reasoning or appeals to memory would pierce that armor of entitlement they had built. They had decided I was incapable, irrelevant, and ready to be managed like a project. The irony, of course, was that in their haste to take control, they had handed me all the evidence I would need to justify what I was about to do. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite conversation, but I was no longer truly present. My mind was elsewhere, running through the steps, the timing, the precise way I would take back the narrative they had tried to write for me. By the time the coffee service began, my decision was absolute. I would not wait for them to come to me with paperwork. I would not give them the chance to spin another story about how they were rescuing me from myself. Instead, I would act on my own terms, and when I did, the shock would be sharp enough to cut through their self-assuredness like glass shattering on marble. A waiter passed by with a tray of small chocolates, and I took one, unwrapping it slowly as if it were the most important thing in the room. Outwardly, I was composed, even relaxed. Inwardly, the storm had reached its peak, but it was no longer wild. They didn't realize that Wall was now closing in on them. I waited for the right moment, not because I wanted an audience, but because I wanted them to understand that this wasn't done in haste or in anger. This was a decision born of clarity. I caught the eye of Richard, my old friend, and gave him the faintest nod. He had been with me at the lawyer's office just a week earlier, had sat across the polished oak table while I signed the papers that would remove any doubt about the future of my home. He knew the details, and he knew that the moment I was about to choose would burn itself into memory. The dessert plates had been cleared, coffee poured, and a few guests had begun to gather their coats. Laura was laughing at something Michael had said, her head tilted back in a way that made her look young again, if you ignore the sharpness in her eyes. Michael was leaning in close to a cousin, outlining some idea for a backyard expansion that would add serious value to the place. I took a deep breath, pushed back my chair, and rose slowly, letting the movement draw attention without demanding it. The chatter softened. A few heads turned. I reached for my glass of water, not champagne, and tapped the rim gently with a spoon. The clear, bright sound carried just enough to still the room. Before we all head home, I began, my voice even, I'd like to say a few words. Michael and Laura exchanged a glance, and I could see it, the assumption that I was about to offer gratitude, maybe even a sentimental nod to their concern for me. I let that assumption linger for exactly 3 seconds. Tonight has been illuminating, I said, scanning the room. I've had the chance to hear my children's plans for my future, my home, and my life. I've listened carefully, as any father would, and I've realized something important. The future of that home doesn't belong to either of them. The silence was immediate and deep. Michael's smile froze, just slightly, while Laura tilted her head, her brows knitting together in confusion. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the familiar edge of the envelope. I pulled it out and placed it on the table in front of me, the cream paper crisp and deliberate. This, I continued, is a signed and notarized transfer of ownership for my house. As of this evening, it no longer belongs to me. A ripple went through the room. Soft gasps, murmurs, the faint clink of a coffee cup being set down too quickly. Michael leaned forward, his voice tight. You sold it? No, I said, my gaze steady. I gave it away. Laura's lips parted, but no sound came out. I let the pause stretch before continuing. The new owner is someone who values it for what it is, not for what it can be turned into or how much money it can make. Someone who understands its history, its purpose, and the memories it holds. My eyes flicked toward Richard, who remained seated but gave the smallest of nods. That someone, I said, is not you. The air seemed to thicken between us. Michael's face darkened, and Laura's hand curled into a fist on the tablecloth. Dad, you can't be serious, Michael said, his voice rising. We're family. Yes, I replied, my tone still calm, and family should respect each other. All I've heard tonight are plans to erase what your mother and I built, to strip away everything meaningful in exchange for convenience and profit. That's not respect. That's possession. A low murmur moved through the guests, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching with open fascination. I could feel the moment tipping, the point where the power dynamic shifted and they began to realize this was not an argument they could win. Laura tried a softer approach, leaning forward, her voice quieter. We were just trying to help, Dad. You're taking this the wrong way. I smiled faintly. If this is help, I'd hate to see what harm looks like. I slid the envelope closer to me, not for their benefit, but to remind myself of the finality of what I'd done. The deed has already been filed. The house now belongs to someone who will keep it as it is, who will preserve the garden your mother loved, who will sit in the chairs I built with my own hands. You'll never have to worry about it again. Michael opened his mouth, but I held up a hand. No arguments. No negotiations. It's done. The finality in my tone seemed to land harder than the words themselves. For the first time that evening, they looked truly unsettled. Not angry in the way they had been before, but unsure, off balance, as if the ground beneath them had shifted without warning. And it had. I'll let the silence stretch again, then raise my glass. To 70 years, I said, and to making decisions while you still can. A few guests clapped hesitantly, unsure whether this was a moment to celebrate or to tiptoe around. I didn't care. This wasn't for them. This was for me, and in a way, for Margaret, who would have hated to see her children turn into the kind of people they had become tonight. I drank the water, set the glass down, and took my seat again. The moment had passed, but the aftershocks would linger. I could see it in their faces. They were calculating now, trying to piece together how this had happened without them knowing, how their months of silent scheming had been undone in a single, controlled move. Michael was the first to break. He pushed his chair back with a screech that cut through the quiet, the sound harsh against the polished wooden floor. Are you insane? he demanded, his voice loud enough to make a waiter freeze mid-step. You gave our family home to a stranger? After everything? After all we've done for you? I stayed seated, meeting his glare with calm eyes. After everything you've said tonight, it's clear the home means more to me than it ever did to you. Michael slammed his palm onto the table, rattling glasses. We've been planning for months to make that place better, to actually use it for something worthwhile. And you just threw it away. Better for who? I asked evenly. Worthwhile to who? Every plan you've shared tonight was about what you could take from it, not what you could give to it. You've treated it like a prize to be claimed, not a legacy to be respected. Laura's voice cut in sharp and cold. You blindsided us. You've been sitting there all night letting us talk, letting us plan, and you never said a word about this. Do you have any idea how manipulative that is? I turned to her, my voice steady but firm. I'll let you talk because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought the house was already yours. Tonight, you showed me exactly that. She shook her head, disbelief flashing in her eyes. You've lost it. You're 70 years old, and you're making reckless decisions because you were sentimental and stubborn. That house should have stayed in the family. I felt a bitter smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Family isn't about blood alone, Laura. It's about respect, care, and love. You've shown me tonight that you value none of those things when it comes to me or the home I built. Michael took a step closer to me, leaning over the table as if proximity alone could intimidate me. We could fight this. You can't just sign away something like that without. I cut him off. It's already filed. It's legal. You can fight it if you want, but all you'll do is waste your time and your money. The law doesn't care about entitlement, Michael, and neither do I. A collective murmur rose from the guests. Some were clearly on edge, others watching with the rapt attention of people witnessing a long overdue confrontation. The waiter who had frozen earlier quietly backed out of the room, no doubt eager to avoid being caught in the middle. Laura tried another tactic, her tone shifting from anger to pleading. Dad, just think about this. You could still change your mind. We could work something out. We don't have to make this ugly. I let the plea hang in the air for a moment, watching the desperation settle into her features. It's not ugly because of me, I said finally. It's ugly because of how you've behaved. I didn't create this moment. You did. All I did was decide I wouldn't let it continue. Michael's hand curled into a fist, but he didn't swing. I could see the war in his eyes, the need to lash out clashing with the awareness that every move he made was being watched. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair. So that's it. You're cutting us out completely. From the house? Yes, I said. From my life? That's up to you. But understand this. If you want a relationship with me, it will be built on respect, not control. Laura exhaled sharply, as if trying to push down the anger threatening to spill over. You'll regret this, she said quietly, her voice trembling. I shook my head. I've regretted a lot of things in my life, but protecting that home and its history won't be one of them. The room seemed to exhale with me, the tension loosening just enough for the guests to start murmuring again. A few of them avoided looking at Michael and Laura, but others were openly judging them, their disapproval clear. That was another unintended consequence of their arrogance. They had managed to turn public opinion against themselves in a single night. Richard caught my eye from across the room and gave the smallest of smiles, as if to say, it's done. And it was. Michael and Laura were left standing in the center of the gathering they had dominated all evening, stripped of the prize they had been so sure was theirs. They looked smaller somehow, their certainty drained away and replaced with the realization that they had overplayed their hand. I rose from my seat, not with haste, but with the measured movement of someone who has nothing left to fear. Thank you all for coming tonight, I said to the room, my voice carrying clearly. It's been a memorable birthday. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I stepped away from the table, feeling the weight of 70 years on my body, but none of it on my mind. The house was safe, my decision was final, and for the first time all evening, I felt truly free. Behind me, I could still hear Michael and Laura whispering fiercely to each other, their voices tight with anger and confusion. I had expected Michael and Laura to be upset, but I hadn't anticipated the speed or intensity with which the fallout would spread. By 9 o'clock, my phone had already begun buzzing with calls and messages. Some were from relatives who had been at the party, offering quiet words of support. Others were from people who had only heard the story secondhand, eager to confirm whether it was true that I had given the family home to a stranger. The word rolled off their tongues with that peculiar mix of shock and gossip, as if the concept of choosing someone outside of blood was unthinkable. The truth was simpler. The person I'd given the house to was hardly a stranger to me. She was the daughter of my oldest friend, a woman who had grown up playing in that garden, who had brought her own children to visit, who had shown care and respect for the place without ever once hinting she wanted it. When Margaret was alive, she used to say that if anything ever happened to us, she'd want the house to go to someone who loved it, not someone who saw it as a stepping stone. I had simply followed through on that promise. Around 10, the first real confrontation came. Michael's number flashed on my phone, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something in me wanted to hear him out, not to negotiate, but to see how far he was willing to push. I answered, keeping my tone neutral. "Dad," he began, skipping any greeting, "we need to talk about last night. You embarrassed us in front of everyone." I sipped my coffee, letting the quiet stretch before I replied. "I think you embarrassed yourselves, Michael. I just made a decision." His voice rose, sharp and quick. "A decision you made without even consulting us. You blindsided us, and now you've given away something that's been in our family for generations." I leaned back in my chair, watching a beam of sunlight crawl across the floor. "The house is in good hands, better than it would be if it were under your plans to gut it and rent it out to strangers for profit." There was a pause, followed by a bitter laugh. "You think you're teaching us some kind of lesson? You're just proving you can't be trusted to make rational choices anymore." The irony of that statement almost made me laugh, but I held it in. "The choice has been made, Michael. You can be angry about it if you want, but that won't change the outcome." He muttered something under his breath, something about lawyers, before hanging up without a goodbye. 10 minutes later, Laura called. Her voice was cooler than Michael's, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "Dad, we could have worked this out privately. Instead, you made a spectacle of it. People are talking." I took another slow sip of coffee. People will always talk. I care more about what's right than what's popular. She exhaled, the sound sharp. "You've cut us out of something that was rightfully ours." "It was never yours," I said, my tone final. "It was mine to give, and I gave it to someone who respects it." There was a long silence before she spoke again, softer this time. "You're punishing us." "I'm protecting something that mattered to your mother and me," I said. "If you see that as punishment, maybe you should think about why." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was tight. "We'll see about that." Then she hung up. I set the phone down, feeling neither triumph nor regret, just the steady certainty that I had done what needed to be done. Over the next few days, the ripples continued to spread. At a family brunch 2 days later, Michael and Laura arrived late, their expressions sour. Conversations halted when they entered, and though a few relatives offered them polite greetings, most kept their distance. It was clear that the performance they had given at my birthday had shifted the way people saw them. I overheard one cousin say to another, "It's no wonder he didn't give it to them," and the words were followed by a quiet laugh. For people like Michael and Laura, reputation was currency, and they had lost a great deal of it in a single night. The person who gained the house visited me on the third day after the party. She brought a pie and a bouquet of fresh roses from the garden. We sat together at the kitchen table, and she told me she would keep everything just as it was. "It's not just the house," she said softly. "It's a piece of you, a piece of her." I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in my chest. In giving the house to her, I hadn't just preserved the building. I had preserved the heart of what it stood for. Later that week, word reached me that Michael and Laura had met with a lawyer. I didn't lose sleep over it. The paperwork was airtight, the transfer complete. Even if they pursued it, all they would achieve was spending their own money to be told what they already knew, that the house was gone from their grasp forever. The calls and messages from relatives began to taper off as the days went by. People moved on to other gossip, other stories. But for Michael and Laura, the wound remained fresh. It was as if erasing the word from their vocabulary could somehow erase the reality of what had happened. I didn't gloat. I didn't bring it up to rub salt in the wound. That wasn't the point. My decision had never been about revenge, though I would be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in watching arrogance meet consequence. No, it had always been about something larger, something I feared they might never understand. The lesson wasn't just for them. It was for me too. One Sunday afternoon, about a month after the party, I invited both of them to meet me at the garden. They hesitated, but eventually agreed, probably because they were still holding on to some hope that I might change my mind. When they arrived, I was already there, pruning shears in hand, the scent of roses heavy in the air. I waved them over, and we walked slowly among the blooms. For the first few minutes, they said little, and I let the silence stretch, the rustle of leaves and the hum of bees filling the space between us. Finally, I spoke. "Do you know why I gave the house away?" Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Laura crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "Because you wanted to punish us," she said. I shook my head. "No, because I wanted to protect it from being turned into something it was never meant to be, from being reduced to a tool for profit, from losing the heart of what it has always been." I paused, running my hand gently over a bloom. "This garden, this house, it's not just wood and brick and soil. It's history. It's the laughter your mother and I shared, the work we put in together, the people we welcomed here. It's the place where you took your first steps, where birthdays were celebrated, where storms were weathered. And last month at my birthday, I didn't hear you talk about any of that. All I heard was what you could take from it, what you could gain." Michael shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the ground. Laura's eyes softened, but her arms stayed crossed. "It's just a house," she said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. I met her gaze. "If you really believe that, then you've already lost something far more valuable than a deed. You've lost the understanding of what makes a place matter. And if you can't see that, then it never should have been yours." We reached the far end of the garden, where the first rose bush Margaret had planted still bloomed. I stopped there, letting the silence sit for a moment. "Your mother told me once that she didn't care who lived here after us, as long as they loved it like we did. That's why I chose who I did. She loves this place. She respects it. She'll preserve it. That's worth more than any check you could cash from renting it out." Michael finally looked up, his expression a mix of frustration and something else, something he didn't want to admit was understanding. "You could have told us that before," he said. I shook my head again. "No, you needed to show me who you were without knowing my decision. And you did." Laura's arms slowly dropped to her sides, and she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks. "So that's it. There's no chance to change your mind." "It's done," I said. "And one day, you might realize it's not the loss of the house that matters. It's the loss of what it stood for. That's what should make you think." They didn't answer, and I didn't push. Some lessons take root slowly, like seeds that wait for the right season to sprout. Maybe this would be one of them. Maybe it wouldn't. That was beyond my control. As they left, I stayed in the garden, kneeling down to pull a few weeds near the roses. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in deep gold and soft lavender. I thought about the decades I'd spent here, about the way the seasons had turned over and over, each one different but familiar. The house would stand through many more. It would outlast arguments, grudges, and hurt feelings. And maybe, just maybe, one day Michael and Laura would walk through the gate, not with a claim or a demand, but with an understanding. For now, it was enough to know that the house was safe, that the values Margaret and I had built into it would endure. It was enough to know that I had chosen principle over appeasement, legacy over convenience. I stood and looked over the garden one last time before heading inside, my steps slow but steady. Some people spend their lives building something only to watch it be dismantled in the name of progress. I wasn't going to be one of them. I had made my choice, and in doing so, I had drawn a line that could not be crossed. It wasn't just about protecting a house. It was about reminding the people closest to me and myself that some things are worth more than money, more than ownership, more than blood ties. Respect, love, history, those are the foundations that last. And in the end, that was the real inheritance I hoped they would one day recognize. The end. If you stayed with me through this whole story, I could truly appreciate it. I put my heart into sharing what happened that night, and I hope the message stayed with you. If you enjoyed hearing my side of things, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next story I have to tell. I'd also love to hear from you. What do you think about the way everything unfolded? Do you believe I made the right choice with the house? Or would you have done things differently? And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from. It's always something special to know how far my words travel. I'll be reading the comments, and I'm looking forward to seeing your thoughts.